Well, with me to discuss that are our political correspondent Tamara Cohen and the commentator and columnist Melanie Phillips. Welcome to you both. Tamara, those latest changes, Chris Skidmore, Esther McVeigh, tell us more.
Yes, so Julian Smith is the big name this morning who has been sacked from his job as Northern Ireland Secretary just after getting the Stormont government up and running in Northern Ireland for the first time in 3 years. That was seen as a huge achievement, but there were some reports at the weekend that the Prime Minister was not happy with some of the details of the agreement that was made, £2 billion given to Northern Ireland and a new probe into some of the activities of British soldiers during the Troubles. That was what was reported at the weekend, so he has now lost his job and we wait to see who will replace him. Theresa Villiers, Environment Secretary, also been in to see the Prime Minister in his Commons office. We expect she's going to get the push as well, and there will be a new Environment Secretary taking on what's going to be an important job over the next year, with Britain hosting some climate change talks. I'd say that the bigger picture of this is that there isn't going to be a St Valentine's Day massacre as we had heard over the last few weeks.
Around already,
but the Chancellor, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, probably the Health Secretary and the Transport Secretary as well, likely to stay in post. But he's clearing out some of the arch-Brexiteers who were put into the cabinet for a specific purpose to get phase one of Brexit done, and now promoting people, new talent in the party, to work on the domestic agenda.
And any thoughts on Chris Skidmore?
Chris Skidmore, Science Minister, not in the cabinet. He's one of the junior ranks. I don't think we were particularly expecting him to get the push. I can't think of an obvious reason why he would.
Well, the reason might be that Dominic Cummings has this big focus on science, wants to have...
Perhaps he has a specific person in mind for that job. But yes, Chris Skidmore was seen as a sort of rising star under David Cameron and Theresa May.
And Melanie Phillips, what do you make of it so far?
Well, I think that people are going to be out there, people among the public are going to be suppressing a bit of a yawn. I mean, it's like, musical chairs, who knows what's going on, who really cares? What matters to people is what Boris Johnson will actually do. Now, I suppose we won't know that until we've seen the actual tenor of his cabinet. But so far, the changes that we've seen, the little that we know, it's very hard to see a clear ideological or political purpose behind them. The removal of Julian Smith, for example, sounds a little bit personal. One just doesn't know. It's very hard to see a clear picture at the moment.
I mean, normally at this time we'd be talking about the view, the opinions in the newspapers. Are you bothered who paid for Boris and Carrie's Christmas holiday?
I can't say this is the top of my concerns when I look at global affairs at the present time, no.
Now, just one of those stories I want to pick out because you're a prominent member of the community. In the Daily Telegraph, Ruth Deach is writing about Westminster Council, who have turned down an application to build that planned Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre next to the Palace of Westminster in Jubilee Gardens. She says there are better places for it, like the War Museum. Do you agree?
Yes, I very much agree with Baroness Deach's position. She's carved a rather lonely furrow in this particular controversy. It's very divisive in the Jewish community, and I'm afraid there are people who leap upon any opposition to this with cries of anti-Semitism. Nothing could be further from the truth. The argument that Ruth Deach makes, which I personally support, is that a memorial is unnecessary. We already have memorials in London and elsewhere in Britain. If you want another memorial, a much better place would be the gardens or grounds of the Imperial War Museum, which is much better equipped. The problem about the proposed site in the Jubilee Gardens is that it's not appropriate because it is a little oasis of greenery. It would be disruptive to that. It would attract a huge amount of traffic, both pedestrian and vehicular. And the point is that why certain members of the community want it there is because they want to make a statement about how importantly Britain views the memorial to the Holocaust by putting it so close to the Palace of Westminster. Well, from my point of view, and I believe from Ruth Deach's point of view, this is gesture politics. What matters much more is the safeguarding of the Jewish community now from the threats that it really does face from real Jew hatred.
I mean, tomorrow, do you see this turning into a major political row?
Well, we've been known for some time that there's been a big clamour to have this Holocaust Memorial Centre in Jubilee Gardens, so I can see a lot of MPs expressing an opinion on it, certainly. But I think, as Melanie was saying, if there is within the Jewish community a variety of views on the subject, I think it will be seen as difficult, especially since the Tory party have made such a big issue about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and thrown their support behind this Holocaust Memorial Centre.
And the whole question of remembrance is getting more difficult as things recede into the past, isn't it?
Well, yes, but it's an unfortunate fact that Britain and Europe now has a plethora of Holocaust memorials, and we are living through a European and British epidemic of anti-Semitism. So I'm afraid it's not true to say that if you focus people's attention on what happened in the past, you will avoid the same thing happening in the present. The opposite seems to be the case.
Thank you both very much indeed. For now, we'll hope to get to the newspapers with your partner, Ian Dunt, who's having a bit of trouble with security at the moment, later on in All Out Politics, and thanks to tomorrow. This is indeed All Out Politics, and coming up next, who's out and who's in Boris Johnson's reshuffle, we'll hear from David Gauke, who shuffled himself out. Well, let's get the view now, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. Of course, there's a certain yesterday's papers element about it, given the changes in the government. Now, social media giants and big tech firms respond to new government regulation in Peter Brook's cartoon in the Times with a big FU in the shape of the Facebook logo. Bernie Sanders is leading the race to become the Democrat challenger to Donald Trump, but he's puffing hard whilst the president urges him to slow down, saying it's a marathon. The fear of Donald Trump is haunting the Democrats, according to Jonathan Friedland, writing in The Guardian. And in the Times, Gerard Baker says Bernie Sanders is playing by the Donald Trump playbook and has more in common with the president than it seems. Boris Johnson has proved his doubters wrong, emerging as a bold commander of the ship of state rather than a bumbling clown. That's the loyal verdict of Leo McKinstry in the Daily Express. The only people who benefit from HS2 are Londoners, so no wonder it's being built, says a grumpy Rod Liddle in The Sun. And finally, the former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt writes in the Daily Telegraph, urging greater transparency and more government support for maternity units to prevent babies dying. Well, joining me today to look through those are the Times columnist Melanie Phillips, who's been braving the elements here, and joining us from Millbank is Ian Dunt. He's the editor of politics.co.uk. And Ian, we gather been having a bit of a problem with the security this morning.
Yes, I'd love to tell you that it was a conspiracy by Dominic Cummings to stop me from getting near Downing Street, but it is in fact because I forgot my pass.
Well, we're sorry about that, but we're delighted you're with us. Now, let's talk about those. First of all, let's start with Leo McKinstry and his 3 cheers for Boris Johnson, that he's a bold commander of the ship of state, not a bumbling clown. What do you reckon, Melanie?
Well, I think this is a bit of ripe journalism and distinctly premature. Certainly, Boris Johnson has put aside the bumbling clown image and has constrained himself to behave in a more statesmanlike fashion. But the deeds that he has already performed, I think, are highly questionable. For example, what we read that the Chancellor is about to unveil in tax rises, this idea that if you throw money at the northern working class that delivered this victory, that will be enough to buy their support, I think misreads that constituency. The HS2 decision, highly questionable. People in the north for whom it is supposedly intended say, we'd rather you get the existing trains running on time, please.
On this one, are you?
Well, I am with myself on this one. That's what I think. And other decisions, the decision to go in with Huawei, which, from what I read, is a tremendously dangerous step for in terms of the security of the country. Many other decisions like that. So we have yet to see quite how this government is going to unveil, what he's going to unveil. For me, one of the most questionable things that Boris Johnson has already committed himself to, and I realise this is a tad controversial, is the green agenda. Because what he's committing himself to, the government, is a programme which would at the very least massively hike up the living costs of millions of those famous working class people and others on whom he depends for his victory, in pursuit of a target which, even if it were to be achieved, would contribute virtually nothing to changing the climate.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Ian Dunt, what do you reckon? Boris Johnson, clown or statesman?
I agreed with about half of what Melanie said, which I think is sort of a record for us. I mean, you're in quite a difficult position right now. I mean, look at the news this morning. If you're trying to make this argument that he's this sort of elder statesman and extremely decisive and all of that, most of the news reports about Boris Johnson this morning, putting aside the cabinet reshuffle, are about his holiday that he decides during Christmas to spend 15 grand on a holiday. He has the money to pay for this holiday himself. He was paid extraordinary amounts of money when he was a journalist before he, decided to become prime minister. And yet he decided to put it down in someone else's name, who then denies that they gave him the holiday, guaranteeing that this story goes on for a week. Now, if that is the actions of this decisive, heroic prime minister, then I don't want to see what the alternative is.
Now, what about Bernie Sanders? A lot of comment about him. He, of course, emerged narrowly first in the New Hampshire primary. Do you see similarities, Ian, between him and Donald Trump?
Yeah, there are. I mean, the obvious thing from a British perspective is obviously between Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, and they're quite legion. But there are similarities with Donald Trump, and I think they're ones that the Democrats might actually pay a little bit more attention to. The Friedland piece argues Trump is sort of in the Democrats' head. I mean, this is what happens when you have a president who's very, very unpredictable, who's very chaotic, and who's extremely aggressive. And you start to find yourself in a relentlessly defensive posture. But actually, the lesson to take from Donald Trump, especially for liberals and people on the left, is that if you are authentic, if you have a very clear message, if you speak in a way that doesn't sound like it's been focus grouped into oblivion, then actually voters might start paying attention to you. And on that basis, I don't think on the politics, which are much more complicated, he's probably far too far to the left for most of American voters, but in the manner that Sanders comes across, he could actually be a very effective opponent.
Do you think he's a contender, Sanders?
He seems to be, and I think that what his rise shows us is once again what we already have seen, that it's the people who stand for a really out of left or right field challenge to the political status quo who are going to come forward, because people are just fed up with mainstream politicians. And we've seen this over and over again. And we've seen also the polarization of politics, particularly on the left, which has vacated, in my view, what used to be the kind of leftish centre ground and moved very much further left. We saw this with Jeremy Corbyn, and we're seeing it with Bernie Sanders. And if they're not careful, the Democrats are going to fall into precisely the same trap, that the further left they go, the more they're going to drive the people that they want to attract to them into the camp of Donald Trump.
A point was made to me by an academic commentator in New Hampshire yesterday that Democrat presidents who get elected have a positive message. And Sanders, like Jeremy Corbyn, is very much a negative message, that our society is unfair, people are suffering, we need to change it.
Well, this is the point about both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. Whatever you think of what they're doing, the image they are projecting is one of tremendous optimism. Make America great again. Boris Johnson says, we are on the verge of Britain being great again.
And
it's
we're
the same
get
message.
A lot of things done,
and it's very attractive to people. People are fed up with being told that everything's going to hell on a handcart. They want a positive message, whether or not it's deliverable.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. Pleasure talking to you. You're watching All Out Politics. We're in Downing Street today for the government changes, the reshuffle, who's in and who's out, as Boris Johnson reshuffles his cabinet.